He was a man who was considered one of Germany's most skilled field marshals of the Second World War. However, he was also a man accused of being involved in the executions and slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. At the end of the Second World War, Walter Model, who was said to have been a skilled defensive commander, had encountered a number of problems due to the defeat of the German army during the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes Offensive is often seen as Hitler's last roll of the dice, but Model's forces were then later encircled in the Ruhr pocket, and with no way out, the Field Marshal would decide to die by his own hand after learning he was going to be condemned by the Soviets as a war criminal if they captured him, and that he would most probably be executed also by the Americans if captured by those forces. But Walter Model, inside of a forest with an assistant, decided to bring his life to an end and decided to not see out the end of the Second World War. He wanted to be the one who had a say in his demise, and not a courtroom or an executioner on the gallows. Join us today as we look at the death of Walter Model, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Walter Model joined the army as a teenager, and he served as part of the 52nd Infantry Regiment, but as the First World War broke out, he served on the Western Front, but did pick up a serious injury near to Arras in May 1915. He was wounded also later again, but was then recommended for German General Staff training, and he rose throughout the ranks until at the end of the conflict he was made a captain. Following the German defeat, Model remained as part of the reformed army, which had been limited by the Treaty of Versailles to 100,000 soldiers, which was also known as the Reichswehr. But in the years running up to the Second World War, he became close friends with other future German generals and field marshals, including Friedrich Paulus, and he also attended different meetings with Wilhelm Keitel, who would become the most senior figure in the German military during the Second World War. In the 1930s he commanded battalions during the time in which Hitler was building up his army for the Second World War in preparation, and he was a man who was a supporter of Hitler and the Nazi Party. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Model served as the Chief of Staff for the 4th Corps during the invasion of Poland. Their campaign was only brief and it lasted around 11 days, but they fought in some of the hardest fighting in Poland, and they were then involved in the occupation of the Lublin region. But during the invasion of France, Model was also involved with the 16th Army, and he continued to impress, including even those in the highest positions in government, and he was then made a general. He gained his first senior command position when he was assigned to lead the 3rd Panzer Division. This was seen as a prestigious step up for him. He was not previously experienced with leading armoured units. However, his forces were assigned to fight on the Eastern Front and were to become involved in Operation Barbarossa. As a leader, Walter Model was not the most formal with organisation. This led to him becoming more endearing to his soldiers, but some other leaders were not happy with this. He grouped his soldiers' training in different ways. When Operation Barbarossa was launched, his forces did very well, crossing the Dnieper River, with not many casualties, and this followed with weeks of tough fighting, as his forces broke up groups of Soviet forces. Later, due to his actions and the actions of other commanders, 665,000 Soviet soldiers were taken as prisoners of war in a trap. Model's forces were also known for their speed, and he also took part in assaults heading towards Moscow, and the advance of his men stopped as winter caused chaos. Temperatures led to vehicles freezing, as did weapons, and Model continued to study the battlefield at this time, but he also continued to lead his troops across the Soviet Union. There were anti-partisan raids carried out by his men, which led to the mass slaughter of people, but also Model, during one assault, ordered the deportation of all male civilians to be sent elsewhere, and he also ordered wells to be poisoned and dozens of villages to be razed to the ground, being torched to prevent further Red Army bases being established. Walter Model, because of his actions, and actions like these, became at the top of the list of wanted war criminals who were hunted for what was known as deliberate extermination policies, and it was said that the killings of civilians were being carried out by regular army forces, such as his, and not just units of the SS. Model also took part in the northern part of the Kursk assault on the 5th of July 1943, and following the failings of Kursk, he was then sent to Estonia to try and stop Soviet advances throughout the land, but the Germans were by this time in the conflict on the retreat. But on the 1st of March 1944, Model was made the youngest Wehrmacht officer to become a Field Marshal, but it was clear on the Eastern Front that the German situation was doomed, and that Model could not do anything to prevent this, as his defensive soldiers were just being overwhelmed by the sheer might of the Red Army. He did manage to win some victories over the Soviets, however he was then transferred to France and Normandy. His first order was to convince Hitler to allow the retreat of the German 7th Army and Panzer Group Eberbach, and he managed to rescue a number of units to fight another day, despite the fact they lost most of their tanks' armour and other weapons such as artillery. Hitler also ordered that Paris should be held out and not conceded, and Model replied he could only do this if he had 200,000 extra soldiers and a number of other panzer divisions, but the German army did not have this. Walter Model was then involved in Operation Market Garden and defending against Allied forces, as following the airborne landings, he believed that he was the target for the Allies, that the Allies were trying to arrest him and capture him. He ordered his soldiers into action, and he believed it was an opportunity to counterattack and push the Allies out of the south parts of the Netherlands. He and his men fought well and led to a brutal defeat for the Allies, and the victory at Arnhem helped to restore Model's reputation and confidence, which had been damaged in Normandy. He was frustrating the Allies, and this continued in the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest and at Aachen, in which thousands of casualties were inflicted upon his enemies. But Hitler would then play his last card, ordering the Ardennes Offensive, the counterattack which became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Model thought the plans were not achievable with the resources at his disposal. It had limited successes, but the lack of air cover and inexperience of his soldiers, as well as a lack of fuel, caused major problems, as did the inability to capture road junctions at Bastogne and the weather. But Hitler then ordered Model's forces to remain, defend their positions until the very end and death. They were now involved in fighting the Americans across the Rhine River, which the Americans would cross at the bridge at Remagen. This was the beginning of the end for Walter Model, as on the 1st of April his troops found themselves surrounded in the Ruhr by the Americans, and Hitler wanted his commanders who remained to dig in and fight defensively. There would be no surrender or breakout attempt, and he wanted to fight an incredibly defensive battle. Hitler also ordered much of the industrial centres in the Ruhr to be blown up, but Model ignored these instructions. He was called upon by the Allies to surrender, rather than to pointlessly send his soldiers to the slaughter, but he was torn by his oath to Hitler and the sense of duty he had as a field marshal. Because of this, Model would dissolve much of his forces. The oldest and the youngest were discharged from military service, and the remaining men were to either leave to surrender or attempt breakouts under their own orders. Army Group B were then declared traitors by Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, for their work and what they were doing, and with this Walter Model knew his reputation, in Hitler's eyes, was now in tatters, and that if he would be captured by the Germans, then he would face execution most probably. He had to make a decision as to hand himself over to the Allies, in which he knew he was a wanted man, to hand himself over to Hitler, or to take a different course of action. He dissolved his command, and with this he said, "Has everything been done to justify our actions in the light of history? What can there be left for a commander in defeat? In antiquity, they took poison." It was clear to those around him that he was a defeated man, and someone who was looking to take his own life. This decision was affirmed when he was told that the Soviets had in absentia indicted him for war crimes relating to the deaths and executions of 577,000 people inside of concentration camps in Latvia, and also the deportations of 175,000 people in slave labour programs. At this time, Model was near to the city of Duisburg, and on the 21st of April 1945, Walter Model, accompanied by an assistant or adjutant, drove out to some woods, having made the decision to end his life. Near to Ratingen, it was said, a staff officer again urged Model to surrender. Once again Model said, "I simply cannot do it. The Russians have branded me a war criminal, and the Americans would be sure to turn me over to them for hanging." Late in the afternoon of April the 21st, Model told Colonel Pilling, "My hour has come. Follow me." Model led his aide deep into the forest. There he drew out his pistol from its holster and instructed Pilling, "You will bury me here." Field Marshal Walter Model ended his life with a single shot. He took out his pistol and shot himself in the head with this. Then after this, his adjutant, Colonel Theodor Pilling, buried him in a grave where he died, almost giving him a soldier's burial where he fell. But this would not be the end, as a decade following the death of Walter Model, Pilling helped to have Model's remains recovered from the field grave and site where he was interred, and his remains were then exhumed. A reburial was arranged for the Field Marshal's decaying corpse, which was interred inside of a German military cemetery in the Hurtgen forest. Today only a small stone marks the site where Walter Model, the German Field Marshal, was buried, but he was a commander who was said to have been excellent defensively and who had an outstanding talent for improvisation. He was a pioneer in many ways and had a very good eye for detail. However, his relationship with Hitler was one which was complex, and Hitler did seem to trust him fully. He claimed that he was his best field marshal and was the saviour of the Eastern Front, but Model often ignored orders that he felt he could not follow, and he also himself was a Nazi, let's remember. Model often lectured his soldiers to have complete faith and obedience to Hitler and the Nazis, and his troops were involved in a number of war crimes also. But inside of a forest, with the war lost for him, Walter Model knew that he probably would be executed at the end of the Second World War, and he made the decision to die by his own pistol. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.